Hi, everyone. Today I'm joined by Neil Theise. Neil is a professor of pathology at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, for one, also a longtime student of Zen Buddhism. But the thing we're going to be talking about primarily in this conversation is Neil's book, Notes on Complexity, a scientific theory of connection, consciousness, and being, which won the 2024 Nautilus Book Award gold medal in science and cosmology. So congratulations, that is quite an honor. This is a book that covers a lot of topics that basically make you as sort of an interviewee sort of prime candidate for this podcast, given the kinds of things that we tend to focus on. So I'm really excited to explore this. We'll set it up in a second, a little bit more in some more depth. But thank you, Neil, very much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, sure. Thanks for having me.
So, okay. This book. So when I saw this book come out, Notes on Complexity, I immediately thought, ooh, I would love to talk to this brilliant human being who's written this thing, because you kind of covers some of the big things. This is a very ambitious ambitious work, despite it's not a vast tome, but you cover a lot of ground, and it's the big topics. I could briefly set it up, but maybe it'd be better if you do, and then we can kind of go from there. I mean, what is this book doing? What were you trying to do with this book, and what is the ground that you're aiming to cover with it?
Yeah, people have been trying to get me to give them an elevator pitch for a couple of years. My agent, Amanda Annas, came up with something like from mathematics to meditation, life and meaning. I normally I'm sort of at a loss. It's covers the basics of complexity theory and mixes that in with quantum physics and biology and mathematics and philosophy and consciousness studies and a little bit of Buddhist metaphysics and Jewish mysticism and a few other things. So it's kind of about everything.
Yeah.
That's not a very elegant elevator pitch, but it's...
Well, I mean, it's... Yeah, no, go for it.
I like to say... And it's only 172 pages of text with pictures.
I personally bought it for the pictures and was surprised that that there was so much more to it than that. No, this is, yes, it's a smorgasbord of many wonderful things. The whole first section one is on complexity. Then you move into, in section 2, complementarity and holarchy, or the boundless body, and then section 3 is consciousness, which I think that tracks pretty well with my experience of going through this. And so, as you say, in the first part, you kind of lay out what's this whole complexity science thing. You talk, about a number of sort of key aspects of all of that, from cellular automata to, Stu Kaufman's work and a number of things on that front, and sort of the edge of chaos and thinking about complex systems as these self-organizing entities that, have these multi-layers to them and whatnot. And then the second part seems to be about moving into the different layers themselves and kind of focusing on the fact that as you zoom in at any particular layer, it's a little bit of this kind of holarchic Russian doll thing where you were looking at one level, but when you zoom in, there's like a whole other new level. And so you kind of seem to be questioning the whole notion of these boundaries. What really is a boundary? What is an entity versus not? This sort of a thing. And then in the last section on consciousness, bringing that into dialogue with, surprisingly but interestingly, and what we'll talk about in a second, Kurt Gödel's Incompleteness theorem and some of the mathematics there, and this sort of notion of the incompleteness aspects of reality, I guess you could say, and also the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum theory, and how that relates to consciousness, and then talking about, yes, as you say, the Buddhist metaphysical, not just Buddhist, but a couple of different sort of non-dual metaphysical systems, and tying all that together. How does that do for a longer elevator pitch?
Yeah, same thing.
Okay.
So what's it about? It's kind of about everything.
Yeah.
And what it means. One of the issues I've had for a long time scientifically, I didn't train formally as a scientist per se. I wanted to be a scientist growing up. In fact, though every year what kind of scientist kind of changed. But astronomy and cosmology, and then I bumped into Einstein a teacher in 7th grade gave me The Universe and Dr. Einstein, also a very slim volume about a very giant topic. And that blew my mind. And then I found shortly after in our public library a book called The 30 Years That Shook Physics by Hans Bethe, who was one of the early quantum physicists. And that blew my mind. And I decided I was going to be either a cosmologist or what we called at the time a particle physicist. And then I used my bar mitzvah money to go to Israel my junior year of college, of high school, to study at the Weizmann Institute. And I was the only American in a room of, I think, 6 or 7 European students. And they'd all had serious, robust educations in quantum mechanics. And I read books in the public library because my school system didn't do that. And I really couldn't keep up. And I thought, oh, I don't have what it takes to be a scientist. And for a variety of reasons, when I went to college, I defaulted kind of into being pre-med. That's a more pathetic, longer saga that we can get into if it comes up. But so I went to medical school, not really because of the science aspect, the science I could do, but the nutshell is I was coming out to myself as a gay kid, and I thought that meant I was going to be alone forever. That was my formula in 1977, 78. And I thought, well, if I go to medical school, I'll have important relationships with people and my life will have meaning, even if I'm alone. And it turned out I'm not alone. I didn't need medical school to do that. But basically I became a clinician. I wasn't looking to do basic science. But then that turned because I'm a pathologist. This is my microscope. I showed you before, but I'll show your audience now. Here's a slide, for example, those 2 little pink things, that's a liver biopsy. And this lets me look at human tissues under the microscope all day long. And it took me a while to realize, oh, I'm doing investigatory research, but it's more of the natural historians of the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, rather than the kind of things that get grant funding, which are hypothesis driven. You have a question, you sort out 5 years of research, how you're going to answer it. And that's just not been my method. Looking at the slides, noodling around in them, I started to figure out where the liver was concerned that, livers have stem cells. That used to be a very controversial question. And my chairman sent me off to learn some basic science stuff to sort of prove that. That didn't really take me where we expected to go, but it got me into stem cell research, which is what led me into complexity theory, which gets me to all of this. I'm saying all that because my method has not been ask a question that interests me, drill down into the reductionist kind of things that might answer that question. I noodle around and see where my nose leads. And the liver stuff led to the stem cell stuff, led to complexity theory. And the more I noodled around in complexity theory, it started to lead to bodies as cells, bodies as molecules, bodies as atoms. And then suddenly I'm doing quantum theory again. And then, now we have to talk about consciousness. So,
well, and a much more highfalutin term for noodling around is interdisciplinary generalist, exploring intricative formulations of different knowledge fields. How does that work?
Yeah. So my editor for the book, the first version of my book started with the introduction as the reason I can write a book like this is because I'm a dilettante and I bounce around. And his first comment to me was, no, you're writing a book. You have to be an expert. You're a polymath. You're not a dilettante.
Yes. Polymath. Yeah.
But either way, I don't hang on too tightly to my lane. And one of the reasons I can get away with it is that my clinical work pays my salary. Um, as long as I'm giving good diagnoses to the liver transplant team, no one cares what I'm writing about Gödel or the Copenhagen interpretation or whatever.
Well, I think there's actually something in the broader kind of metamodern turn, which again, this is a name of this podcast, Metamodern Spirituality. We tend to focus on spiritual topics of, everything from, consciousness, meaning, spirituality, grand narratives, this sort of stuff, but from a metamodern lens. And I think that there's always kind of been a sort of fluctuating, oscillating dialectic historically between like generalization versus particularization. And if the postmodern moment represented a lot of particularization, everyone kind of really getting siloed or focusing on the specifics, I do think we're moving back into the era of a kind of integrative generalization. And that seems to be something characteristic of so I think there's a great need. And I think there's also an importance in revalorizing the importance of people being able to work in transdisciplinary ways and bringing in these different fields in conversation with each other, because that's the only way you get the big picture about things.
No, exactly. And that's where the fun stuff. And I think that whatever the faults of the 21st century are, one of the upsides is that we have to now be reassembling all this amazing information that we've gotten from reductive sciences back into systems. Mm-hmm. And of course we do, but it was not valued for a number of generations, but I think we're now in a generation where it's becoming valued again.
Yeah.
And that gives me a lot of delight. I find one of the really exciting things to me with the book, I mean, in general, it's wandered out into some very interesting places that, weren't my intention, but I'm happy to see it go there. But younger people, meaning in their teens and 20s, are starting to find the book. Their grandparents and their parents are giving it to them for their birthday and stuff. And some are reaching out to me, and they're hungry for this kind of cross-disciplinary stuff.
Yeah.
And it's, why do we even need a term like that? But we do, because we're coming out of a series of generations where things were very siloed. This is more of a rebalancing, I think.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I mean, gosh, we could probably spend a whole podcast just talking about those dynamics in academia and a million other things and more of your biography. But yeah, so I think that's a good, and then helpful context for this book, though, is bringing your background in kind of specifically the biological sciences, but then bringing in, as you were talking about through, your journey via your medicine training into these different fields of complexity and whatnot. And then, of course, also trying to fold in the sort of Zen meditative practice and all that. There is a kind of big picture that comes through in this book. And so let's dive into that a little bit. Sure. I think actually probably for the purposes of this conversation, a lot of folks probably tuning into this will have a sense already of the complexity stuff. I don't know. I love
your phrase. I don't know whether you came up with it, but when I've heard on some of your other interviews, you talked about the complexity stack. And I was like, oh, I wish I had thought of that. That's a really good phrase.
I might have. The idea
the first third of the book is building up the complexity stack as I see it, / and or experience it.
Yeah. And I feel like Greg Enriquez probably gave me the term stack, and then talking about, but I do think that that's a helpful kind of way of thinking about it. So I think we can kind of move through that. I think people will already be working with a lot of that framework already. And then that leaves us with kind of drilling down into the more, you could say the bigger, big picture stuff, which then becomes a bit more both contentious, speculative, and then here's where I think some meaningful sort of branches of thought begin to diverge once you kind of already have integrated this complexity framework and then try to consider what the implications are. And so the main thing I'd love to explore a bit with you, or at least the first thing, is around the issue of consciousness and whether or not it is emergent or fundamental, right? And so this is a big thing in the book that you get into. And maybe the best way to do that would be if you want to take a couple of minutes and set up the argument for using complexity thought to sort of, you can almost say, deconstruct what we tend to think of as, anything really, like
Yeah,
any kind of given boundary entity, that sort of a thing. And then how you use that to ultimately kind of end up in an idealist framework for consciousness.
Yeah. So there are, I present the book as though it's this logical sequence, but, you talk to any scientist who's come up with some sort of discovery of interest, and it's actually usually intuitive flashes of insight, and then they figure out how to explain it to people in a logical fashion. So for me, the entering into the complexity theory stuff, it was because I was doing stem cell research, and I was put together with an artist named Jane Prophet, who had, we were funded by the Wellcome Trust. They were just interested in seeing how two people in completely different fields could talk to each other, getting at the understanding basics of like how creative interdisciplinary stuff would happen. And I was explaining to her how, from our work, stem cells are moving around the body. They're moving out of the bone marrow to other organs, from other organs back into the bone marrow. This was our adult cell plasticity stuff, which was big at the turn of the millennium. And she said, oh, the way you talk about that is like how I've heard complexity people talk about ants and ant colonies. And that's how I got into complexity theory. And so we were already there at the idea of, well, beings, ants, or people, interact with each other and self-organize into larger scale structures. But now we're talking about how cells do that. And it's kind of obvious, though it took a while to get here, but to notice that, well, cells are self-organizing into physical bodies, and bodies are self-organizing into larger scale structures. What's the structure? And is it the colony? Is it the body of the ant? Is it the cell? And this was, in Zen practice, we talk about koans, like what's the sound of one hand clapping, being the most famous one probably. It's a presentation of reality that can't be metabolized on a purely intellectual basis. It has to be on an experiential sort of basis. And I felt like the way I had been raised in contemporary science is there was a correct answer. This body is a body, or it's made of cells. And the fact that I couldn't figure out something that tilted it in a definitional direction, even slightly in favor of one or the other, kind of made me nuts. And I was just wandering around thinking about this. And this story isn't in the book. It was, but my editor said no.
Editors.
Yeah, you talk about this in interviews later, and here we are. So it was weeks of, maybe months, of gnawing on this in an obsessional way that I couldn't let go of. It wasn't that I wanted to answer this question. I just couldn't not dismiss it. And I was walking down a street in Manhattan and came to an intersection, and there was a do not walk sign. And I'm thinking, is my body a body or is it cells? Is it body, is it cells? I'm just caught up in this, whether I want to or not. And the light changes and people start to walk off the curb, and I try to move and can't because my leg had become cells. And then it recouped into a leg, and I could cross the street. A few weeks later, I happened to be I was, back in those days, I was the Thursday morning opener for my Zen community, Village Zendo. And back in those days, there were often not very many people there Thursday morning. And I was sitting there by myself, and I'd lit a stick of incense on the altar, and then I was meditating, and I was supposed to be following my breath. That was my practice at the time. And but I wasn't following my breath. I was body your cells, body your cells, body your cells. And at some point during the meditation, for some reason, I looked up and I saw the stick of incense turning into smoke. And I always wonder if I'm going to stop getting choked up when I get to this point in the story. And so far, I haven't stopped. And all of a sudden, I realized stick or smoke, body or cells, it's the same thing. It's the same question. And it's the question about everything. And it was an experience, not an idea in the moment. It was an experience that there's no such thing as a thing. Emptiness of inherent existence, the Buddhist way of describing it. And the next thought I had was, oh, I understand why death isn't scary. And I have to tell my mother about this. She was getting older and was nervous. And then the moment sort of passed and it turned back into ideas. But in Zen practice, you go to your teacher when you have an insight in one-on-one interview. And so we did the formal process. And I said, I think this is what emptiness is. And she said, yeah. And I said, that's it. And she said, it's simple. That doesn't mean it's easy, but when you get it, it's really simple. So there, I had this direct experience of that, but it was now back into conceptual stuff. But what about cells? Are they a fundamental thing? Because it's not really emptiness of inherent existence if it's only emptiness of bodies. But then I realized, down a level of scale, cells don't exist, they're just molecules. And down a level of scale, molecules don't exist, they're just atoms. And all the way down to the quantum level and the quantum foam. And it's not an infinite regress. You get down to the Planck scale, and that's your limit. There's nothing smaller. But there is no thingness there. And when you get down to the quantum foam, it's things emanating out of the vacuum. There's no assemblage of a thing out of something. And so that, now we're getting close to what the Buddha was talking about. I didn't really care about consciousness as a question. But now that I'm doing this complexity thing, the question comes up. And the question comes up in particular because, the self-organization that complex systems accomplish, give rise to, we refer to it as emergent self-organization. And emergence is kind of this magical thing. You can't look at the interactions of the parts and predict what the whole is going to look like because it's not a machine. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. It's not just limited to the sum of the parts. And I initially thought, that's what brains do. Cells and circuits and architecture and molecules and et cetera are interacting and self-organizing, and they're giving rise to the mind as an emergent property. And that just seems so elegant and straightforward. But it doesn't really solve anything. I didn't really care whether it solved anything at the time because I'm a liver pathologist and I don't really, philosophy has not been my thing. The real surprise here is that the Buddhist stuff and the science stuff were arriving at exactly the same point without any, and that was also something I was never interested in. I didn't care whether my science and my spiritual experiences were matching. But a friend was presenting at the Science of Consciousness meeting at a panel on synesthesias when they were in Stockholm. This was in 2010. And he was nervous about presenting on the panel, and he wanted me to come to the meeting just to sort of be with him in the audience. But to do that, I had to submit an abstract on consciousness. So I started doing a little reading, and I thought, and I'd come into contact with the work of Francisco Varela and autopoietic theory. And that seemed like a good place for me. Cells becoming bodies. Cells are the smallest unit of life. Mind equals life, according to Varela and Maturana. And so cells self-organize into larger scale structures. Small minds self-organize into larger scale things. So I thought, maybe I'm a panpsychist. And that's a complexity thing too. It's just smaller things self-organizing into larger things. but I was stuck with my complexity stack. Why are cells special? And so I started drilling down into, well, what is mind at that point? And looking at autopoietic theory, you could say it's censoring the world, taking in that information, processing it in a complex way, and giving rise to an emergent outcome. Well, molecules kind of do that, and atoms kind of do that. So suddenly I'm becoming a panpsychist, and I submitted that abstract to the Stockholm meeting, just in order to go hold my friend's hand, basically. The second morning of the conference, Minas Kafatos, who's a quantum physicist and a cosmologist and a Kashmiri Shaivist, and was one of the early proponents in book form of saying the universe is just consciousness, taking an idealist stance. And I was aware of his work from when I was a kid. He was the cosmologist who talked about aging brain. You know how plot, light versus mass across the scale, and it's always a logarithmic thing. Everything falls on the line. There's a word for that. In any case, I bumped into that in 7th grade, and then here I am in Stockholm listening to this guy give a talk on consciousness and physics, and he's saying the problem in physics is that we need a new biology the way we needed a new physics. And he describes the new biology, and I'm like, that's my goddamn complexity thing. And I'd already published on it. And I'm like, I've got that new complexity thing. And no one's paying attention. And I actually walked out because I was so annoyed. And then that afternoon, my paper had gotten accepted for a presentation and a little side panel. There were like 20 people in the room, and I was the last of 4 abstracts to be presented. And Minas was the moderator for the session. And I presented my thing, and he was like, I have to talk to you. And that's how I wandered into the complexity stuff. And our first paper was on panpsychism. And, but that consciousness was all the way down to the bottom. And, related in some fashions in a much fluffier way to Hammeroff and Penrose, who I now got to know because I was at these meetings. But the more he and I worked, the more he was coming from a Kashmiri Shaivist point of view, and that experience informed to some extent his views. But he was also very much, as a physicist, in favor of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum theory. And that's kind of pretty clear that consciousness, Planck said it, consciousness is what comes first. I didn't want to go there at first, even though the Buddhist stuff should have said to me, hey, there's something worth doing. But the more we talked over the course of years, and it was really the hard problem. I just couldn't find the endless iteration of neural correlates of consciousness with nothing giving a glimmer ever of an explanation for the hard problem of consciousness. And the idealist point of view makes it all so simple. And my training in science from a kid is that simplicity, if something's simple and explanatory, it probably deserves your attention.
Okay, well, let's.
That's kind of where here we are.
Right. So let's pause there for a minute because there's a lot in there I'd love to zoom in on. A couple of things I guess I'll name, and then because you brought up a couple of things I wanted to touch on. So in a second, I want to zoom in specifically to this whole issue of cellular or body or and that whole distinction, that issue. But you also brought up kind of ultimately this move towards idealism. You also brought up the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, and you brought up using sort of contemplative experiential data, you could say, to inform your metaphysics. And those are all things that came out from the book reading it that was sort of like, I'd love to poke around in these different things. So let's kind of take those kind of in order, I guess. So the first thing there, I'm really interested in this because it seems like this could be semantics. It could be a hang up that I've got that that actually, what seems like maybe a different position is just formulating the issue differently and using different words to describe it. Because I think that there is a profound insight to this notion that, when you keep zooming in, you kind of lose one scale and now you're in a new scale. And then when you zoom in on that, and then that inherently problematizes any kind of neat substance metaphysics that you might want to work with, of just like, oh, a thing is a thing. It's like, well, where does the table end? And so a lot of your work, talking about the microbiome, talking about, when you zoom in, it's sort of like the boundaries of things are porous, I guess you could say, in a certain way. And so all of that, again, profoundly and I think importantly problematizes the notion that everything is just discrete little entities that we can speak of meaningfully as stuff. But then I guess for me, it's like, what do you do with that? What are the implications of that? And so I think, in this book, you're kind of advocating for this notion that, this then leads to this notion of emptiness, drawing on sort of Buddhist notions of like, well, that's what that emptiness is, as you were just saying a minute ago. Yeah. But I'm more inclined to use different language. And then I'm curious if we're really just saying the same thing, but with different language, right? So I'm inclined to say two things. One is that everything is process, right?
Yeah, well, yes.
And I think
I have spent some time hanging out with the Whiteheadians.
Yeah.
When I published some of this stuff early on, they sucked me happily into some meetings, and I got to find out, Whitehead, which eventually will get us around to Gödel, which you left off your list.
Yeah. Well, that's true. That's true.
Okay, we'll get there too. Another way of saying this is everything is process. There is no reifiable thing in the universe. There is only process. Sure. Yeah, that's another way of saying it. A difference for me is, I think, in part because I'm coming at this as a physician who's really concerned with interacting with human bodies and accomplishing things through those interactions, meaning healing, regeneration, etc. There are implications for that. And for that, the community I talk to about this, that the language I use here is very useful to communicate with people who are in medical type stuff of one kind or another. And the implications, which you've hinted at, so thingness is scale dependent. From a distance, an ant colony looks like a thing on the landscape, but you get closer and you realize, no, it's a process arising from interacting ants. You go into the cellular level, and the ant itself as a thing disappears and becomes just a process of interacting cells. Go into the cell, it disappears. Process of molecules in an aqueous solution at body temperature, normal body temperature. So, et cetera, et cetera. But the one implication of that is the notion of boundaries is also scaled and perspective dependent. So at this level of scale, I end here, you end there. And if we were actually in the same room, there'd be two surfaces. We're bounded by our skin. But at the cellular level, where are your boundaries? And if I show you slides of the skin under the microscope, it is a bit more fuzzy than this because you see detail. It's actually finer than we think. And now with the microbiome, with our understanding of the microbiome, our human bodies are not functioning living human bodies without their microbiome. And current estimates are that 50% of the cells in your body are human with your parental DNA, and 50% are other, mostly bacteria, a few fungi, a few viruses, a few other things. We know that your microbiome is essential to conditioning how your body functions and even how your mind functions. Depression can be transmitted by microbiome. Depression can be rectified by microbiome manipulations. And we also know that if you put a bunch of people together in an apartment and their pets, their microbiomes very quickly merge into a single microbiome. What's the thing in that apartment? Is it the microbiome with a bunch of human and dog and cat hosts? Or is it each of those individuals that happen to share this one large scale structure that's influencing all of them? And the microbiome is so, every time I touch my microscope, I'm leaving microbiome behind. Someone comes and sits at my desk and uses my microscope. They're picking up some of my microbiome. You hug someone, you shake their hand, you kiss them, you touch their doorknob, you pick up a glass they used. Microbiome is being exchanged. So where is your boundary?
Well, yeah.
If your body consists of that. You go down through levels of scale, and the smaller you get, the wider the boundary gets, until you get to the quantum level. And at the quantum level, there are no boundaries. So there seems to be, and this is where the complementarity thing comes in, which I think is really crucial. It's that question of, well, can't we tilt it in favor of one or the other? When Niels Bohr brought the term complementarity to bear on the wave particle duality of light, what became clear through the double slit experiments is that how you design the experiment determines which aspect you see. But Bohr was very clear from the get-go that he didn't think this was a quantum physics-based issue, that this was a universal concept. And so our second paper, Manas and I, looked at complementarity through a complexity lens. And the image I use in the book, it's not a perfect image, but it gets, for a general audience, it gets the point across. You have that classic image of two faces in silhouette looking at each other, and the space between them looks like a vase. Which is it? Well, it's both equally, but you can only see one at a given time. You can't favor one over the other.
Yeah.
It's not 50.00001, the two faces, versus 49.9999, and from a complexity, every level of the complexity stack forms a complementarity with all the other views that you are excluding at the moment you choose to select a view. And therapeutically, clinically, we have a direct experience of that. If I want to do orthopedics, I want to function at this level. I don't really care what the cells are doing. If I try to worry about the cells, we're never going to splint that off.
Well, that's kind of where I would want to zoom in on this, is that so okay, yeah, there's agreement then on all of that, right? And then you can see that there's this profound processual nature to reality, and then actually a process ontology is much better than a substance ontology for being able to capture this, right? And so you can think of the idea of,
I love people who can say things like that.
So then, yes. So then we can talk about the no-thing-ness of something, but then we have to kind of clarify what that means. And so I find that sometimes that no-thing-ness of things is it can be interpreted differently, and it requires a real clarity of what we're actually saying. And so to say that something is no thing can be saying that it is not a thing, it's a process, but then that process has some ontic reality to it. Whereas to say that no thing is nothing means that it doesn't have any ontic reality, right? And this might seem like kind of a kind of slippery semantic thing, but
no, I get it. And I think this is why the notion of complementarity is so important. And, in Buddhist terms where, there are Buddhist debates around this question too, God knows. But where I'm landing is that there's no reifiable thing at any level of scale. That doesn't mean there are no things. At this level of scale, we are things.
Yeah.
Walking around on planet Earth, feeling anxious, looking for some reason to keep going and not despair, At the atomic level, there are a few exceptions to this, I understand. We could go into those. But by and large, there's no atom that you didn't, in your body, that you didn't breathe, eat, or drink from the planet, or that your mother didn't. And so from that perspective, we're simply the atomic substance of the Earth that took 3.5 billion years to organize itself into things that worry about themselves and think of themselves indifferent, and pat themselves on the back for being clever and sending a rover to set down on Mars and send pictures back. And that's true. Those engineers at NASA, I wanted to be one of those when I was growing up. But on some level, that's Earth figuring out over 3.5 billion years how to reach out and touch Mars.
Yeah.
Neither view can supervene. So I wouldn't say that the absence of a reifiable thingness means there is nothing. I'd say the notion of nothing is scale dependent and perspective dependent, and always in complementarity to other views. Nirvana versus samsara.
Yeah.
There are people who want to go, well, I just want to get to nirvana and then everything will be fine. There is no nirvana without samsara.
Yeah. Emptiness is form. But that's kind of the thing where I land on is like, there's a difference here, right? Between once you kind of, and we'll just stick with the self for the time being, though we want to drill down on that and get into consciousness in a second. But like, the notion is, all right, you really examine the self and then you kind of deconstruct it. And you're like, oh, actually, in the same way that, or at least one way of doing that is what we're talking about. And then you see, oh, that really isn't a thing. And then people can say, oh, well, I guess there isn't this thing called the self. And actually, there's no me in some kind of sense. But I feel like there's actually an interesting way in which you could almost reframe the whole thing differently, which is that that actually it was just that any kind of simplistic, substance ontology for the self is wrong, but that doesn't mean that some processual informational conception of self isn't actually a more justified notion, and that isn't precisely what complexity science and information theory using, emergent thinking presents us with. So then it seems to be that it's like the takeaway isn't, oh, there is no self. It's like, what is the self? Well, it's a very complex, emergent structure that emerges at a particular level. But when you zoom down that, and like, I feel like that gives you a different picture.
Complementarities and perspective dependent aspects that, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So that's why I was wondering, like, is this a semantic thing? And I see these conversations around these topics play out in ways that seem to absolutize, one form of this or the other. And maybe it is just this, what we're getting at. Yeah.
Right. Well, and that's the key thing where people push. There are many places where people push back. Though judging by my Goodreads reviews, which I no longer look at, but given that this was my first book, it took a while. 20% of people hate the book. Of those 20%, 90% of them hate it because of what I say about quantum physics. And that's okay with me. I don't mind, certainly don't mind getting the pushback. And to some extent, that's the fun part. And if I wasn't getting pushback, I obviously wouldn't have gone far enough. But a big piece of it is people come at me with, yeah, but. And my answer is, right. Whatever, it's two faces, but it's the vase. Yeah, it's the vase. Wait, it's the two faces. I know. The Buddhist thing, I think what Zen in particular cultivates through koan practice to some extent is the flexibility. And the comfort with, oh, this is view dependent. I'm and if you need to see I just had a hip replacement, and boy, is my surgeon a really good carpenter. I don't need him to worry about Kurt Gödel or the Copenhagen interpretation. I need him to be really in his version of reality. That's skillful means for the people he treats. Wouldn't want him talking to me about the depression I had after I had a couple of strokes last year. Wrong doctor, wrong view. So, the Heart Sutra, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is exactly emptiness, emptiness exactly form. What? But that's what Bohr was talking about. That's the fundamental complementary nature of reality. It doesn't faze me.
Yeah. Well,
and now that I'm sort of comfortable with it, I think both spiritually and scientifically, because my practices have matured, I'm also comfortable waiting for people to get that fact.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a common kind of metaphor that I use for this, right, is because a lot of the work that I do focuses on these deconstructive modes of our thought that actually wind up being very illuminating, but also might initially land as, oh no, that's terrible news, and what do we make of that? Right. But there's sort of this move of deconstruction to reconstruction, and hopefully the reconstruction on the other side of that is a lot more expansive and informed and that sort of a thing. And so I remember experiencing some form of this, and I know other people have talked about this, where people will learn that they'll say, oh, you know what? I used to think that like I could touch something, or I could touch, I could hold the hand of my partner or something. But now I know that every time I touch anything, it's just the electrons in my hand repulsed from the other electrons in that thing. And so nothing ever actually touches. And then what this fails to see is that is what touch is, right? That is actually what touching a thing is, and how it works. And that it's actually just again, kind of a smuggled in substance ontology that, people talk about, oh, the atoms are mostly empty space, right? It's emptiness. But then there's just like this little, and so somehow the only thing of matter that is in an atom.
Empty means empty.
Yeah, right. And so rather than I think just the takeaway being, oh, all is emptiness, which can lead to a certain kind of bent towards, I don't know, a kind of negativity or even a kind of nihilism in approaching reality. Yeah, sure. There's just a sense that no, like actually we have a better understanding of that whole self-experience that you're doing and what that actually means and how we can situate that. Right. And so anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there.
I agree with you. And what I would say to the person, and people have said this to me about the touch thing. Yes, that's true. But we're talking about electrons. We're talking about electricity. Bodies are electromagnetic. They just are. Just start with a beating heart. That has an enormous electrical field around it. You're hugging someone. You're sleeping next to someone for 50 years of marriage. And your electromagnetic field isn't touching theirs. It's completely merged. There's repelling, and that's what touch is. And then there's the fact of complete merging. Both are true at exactly the same point, and both are mediated by the exactly the same things, electrons. Electrical attraction and repulsion. So, to me, it's so, and this is the Zen. This is why I'm comfortable with this. There are two reasons, I think. Number one, I spend my day looking at people who are coming in and out of my office, usually seeing me annoyed because I really don't want to be interrupted because I have all these clinical specimens of pieces of people. And then I go back and look through the microscope and I'm looking at cells, which I know are pieces of people. But in my mind's eye and my experience, I've even dreamed being in tissue sometimes. And then the cells are all their own things. I live at those two scales. There aren't a lot of people who get to live at two scales of view. In the book, I talk about this. And, I mention airplane pilots get to do this all day long, too. When I like paying attention to when I'm coming down in an airplane and I'm above the world, I'm above the world, I'm above the world. And then there's some kind of magic world. I get a little bit of a wheezy feeling in my stomach when suddenly I'm in the world at the everyday scale. That transition is kind of magic and it's different. Your perception has changed because of your scale. I practice that all day long. So I think that has cultivated this flexibility of moving back and forth. Most of us just live at the everyday scale. Some of us with real creative imaginations manage to move to other scales. But how often do they practice that?
Yeah.
And with koan practice, that's kind of what you're practicing. Look at it this way. What's the koan look like from the view of the absolute? Okay, you got that. Wait a second, but what about the relative? Okay, you got that. Oh, you let go of the absolute. So it's not cultivating that view versus this view. It's cultivating the flexibility.
Yeah. Yeah, that is very, and I mean, you use that image of the Gestalt, image that you were mentioning earlier with the faces and the vase, and that it is interesting because psychologically, I mean, that's the whole thing, is that we have the difficulty of holding either of those interpretations simultaneously, but that is that kind of non-dual moment where somehow, if one is capable of seeing them both simultaneously, there is, it's kind of.
And I didn't know that's why I couldn't stop thinking about it. But that's why body versus cells, that was the way that presented itself in a way that grabbed my imagination and just wouldn't let go until I came to some resolution.
Yeah.
But the resolution turned out to just open up more boxes and more boxes.
Yeah. Well, so we talked, you mentioned, Copenhagen school. We were just talking about electrons a second ago. Let's move into that aspect of this. And you also mentioned that the 90% of the negative reviews relate to the quantum mechanics aspect of this. So here's a question, and maybe this has already been a concern levied, but you do talk about the double slit experiment.
Give me a concern that hasn't been levied already.
Well, so you talk about the double.
Do it far more eloquently than most. I'll give that.
We'll try. There's nothing new under the sun. So you talk about the double slit experiment, and then you basically, lean into the Copenhagen interpretation of this. But there is this notion that I think I could pull up a quote in a second, but you say something to the effect of this reveals that consciousness is then, sort of the primary aspect here, that's sort of the necessary component. Whereas I feel like that is maybe a popular interpretation of the Copenhagen interpretation, but it's not necessarily
Planck's interpretation. So number one, I feel like I'm in good company. It is, and clear. I mean, how many current interpretations are there? 29, 32, 36 plus. It seems to me those fall into two broad categories. And let's remember, I'm a liver pathologist. I even have more expertise as a very pathetic Zen student than I do as a quantum physicist. But I hang out with the shoulders of giants. A lot of the objections, a lot of the alternate views, the alternate interpretations that push back against the Copenhagen interpretation do so, like Einstein, because they can't cope with the implications of the Copenhagen interpretation. And it's a materialist scramble to find a way to make this problem go away. So, fine. Fine. You want the faces. Fine. But this was a real fundamental problem for no less than Einstein.
Yeah.
And he never, in everything he could do to find a way to eliminate the problem, turned into someone else's Nobel Prize for quantum weirdness, whether it was entanglement or non-locality or. There are other alternatives that for whom that isn't the motivation. But I think that those, to me, from what I can discern, and physicist friends of mine say, okay, this is not unreasonable. I think they're complementary views. And that even within quantum theory, Copenhagen interpretation, classical, and then variations, serve some purposes, but not everything, because nothing serves everything.
Right. Well, I'll try to clarify for me though, there's a difference between with the observer effect, right? We tend to then say, oh, well, then you need an observer. And then we kind of make this semantic slippage into, oh, I observe things, I'm conscious. And so we need that. But when we're talking about observing the electron, it's a sensor. It's a mechanical sensor that's picking up information from the electron. It's not necessarily. So that's where the elision into consciousness
Except
being required.
That you can't really split the difference of when does the effect happen in the experiment, when the electron goes by the sensor or doesn't, or when you open up the box to find out what happened. This was Planck's you can't get behind consciousness. We can't know. It's not unrelated to Schrodinger's cat. until you look. Superposition. And so, is it the sensor? Show me an experiment that proves it's the sensor and not your examination, your setting up of the sensor and your examination of the result.
Yeah. Well, here's a question, though, related to this would be, so if consciousness is this primary thing, then it goes down all levels, right? So why is it just the consciousness, it seems that this is being suggested, it's like human consciousness way up here that's doing the determining factor? Why isn't the base level of consciousness always collapsing the wave function, if that makes sense?
And idealists of my stripe would say that there is one fundamental observer, and that's the fundamental underlying non-dual awareness. That is the fundamental observer, and that's why there is no Copenhagen interpretation that gets away from the conscious observation, because it's, and this is, again, what Planck was saying, the conscious awareness is the thing that comes first. Now, how that happens is a separate set of questions, and I think it's chapter 10. But the other piece here is Gödel. And what Gödel does, we can argue about Copenhagen interpretation, and some of them, I think, are just sort of petulant, stubborn, stamping of your feet against the impossible reality of the nature of existence not being material. But there's
but we pay them no heed anyway, so that's not the issue here.
So, but there are others, and I think that an interesting conversation to be had, which is way above my skill set and pay grade, is, well, in what ways are those complementary views of each other? And so that's one set of questions. No one ever argues when I bring up Gödel, partly because no one knows what I'm talking about.
That always helps.
But I think that's even more fundamental.
Well, let's dig into that, because that was another moment in the book, I'll have to admit, where I was like, wait a second, what did he just do there? This felt like a real sleight of hand. So I'll let you unpack that a bit, because there's this move that you make where, as I interpreted it, you were kind of going from, all right, formal logic can never be completed. Gödel recognized that. And so therefore we can rely on our metaphysical intuitions of reality to fill in an idealist universe. And I was like, wait a second. So I want to poke a little bit at that, but make the argument that you're trying to get at there.
It's really hard, because the other major thing people are asking me to talk about these days is the anatomy of the human interstitium as a body-wide signaling network. And the last 8 lectures or interviews I've had have been on that. So I have to sort of get myself back into Gödel mindset. So, this, he's just so fascinating. His story is just so fascinating. And I'm waiting for someone to explode him in the popular imagination, like last year we got with Oppenheim. So this notion we have in our culture that there are 2 ways to understand, to know, to explain reality are empirical science and formal logic, mathematics. And you walk up to anyone on the street, and if you could get them into this conversation, it may be simply by saying true or false. The best ways of understanding the nature of reality are science and mathematics. Most people would go, yeah, They may not even agree with it, but it would take them a bit to notice, wait a second, but I believe in this. So no, there's a third. The idea that those are the 2 those are the 2 only ways to get at the fundamental nature, true nature of reality. To some extent, that was in the air with World War I, the collapse of church hierarchies and social hierarchies and economic hierarchies in Europe, and because Europe at that point was already becoming global. That was in the air, but the Vienna Circle was a group of philosophers, mathematicians, scientists, philosophers, writers, social scientists. It was quite a diverse group. Brought it into the most coherent form and the most rigorous form to state that, in fact, these are the only two ways to understand reality. And anything that deviates from those is just metaphysics. Anything that can't be answered by empirical science or formal logic, it's not that we need some other thing to explain them. They simply not only don't exist, they're meaningless. To talk about God, soul, life after death, meaning, it's all meaningless. The worst thing a member of the Vienna Circle could say about someone else's argument is, that's just metaphysics. It was the ultimate smackdown. So on the one hand, empirical science, subject-object split. That's what we mean by empirical science, that you have an experimenter examining a system and they are reliably separated from each other, that you can determine things about the true nature of reality without bias or interference. And that works beautifully. I spend my time immersed in the benefits of empirical science. But quantum physics comes in there and goes, at least at one layer of scale, there's no such separation. That's a pretty big whack at the trunk of the two pillars of the Vienna Circle's empirical philosophy. But we still have mathematics. To me, it's kind of interesting that the best expression, so the idea that formal logic can explain everything, is the idea that you could take, let's say, arithmetic, and have a series of fundamental axioms that don't require proof, but accepting those, out of those, you can build a logical system that will contain and prove and explain and connect every fundamental aspect of reality. And the best, most rigorous attempt at that was Whitehead and,
Russell?
Thank you, aging brain. Mathematica Principia. That was their goal. And they weren't doing it because the Vienna Circle said someone should do this. This was already a thing going on in the world of mathematics, that to get mathematics on a firm scientific, not philosophical, not metaphysical foundation was to do this. What's the metaphysical version of mathematics? Well, is math something humans invented to count bushels of wheat or stars in the sky? Or is it something that exists independently of us and we discover them? The materialist view is, no, we invented math to count things. And it's a human invention, and therefore will be utterly consistent. If we just take it all the way to its logical conclusion, we can build this logical structure. The ultimate view that math is somewhere out there, well, where the hell is it? This is the Platonic view of mathematics, mathematical Platonism, that there's an ideal realm that's out there for the human mind to discover, but it exists independently. The Vienna Circle and most of the mathematicians at the time said, no, we can do this. We got this. We can formally prove everything. And then Russell and Whitehead made the best possible attempt to do it. It's mind-boggling what they did. But every time they did it, they found there was something missing or it contradicted itself. And they thought that this was simply a limit of their understanding. The way, when Heisenberg first presented the uncertainty principle, there was the thought that maybe this is a limitation of our technology. And it turned out, no, there is no technology. So here's Gödel sitting in with the Vienna Circle, and one of their hot topics of conversation is Russell and Whitehead and why they haven't accomplished it and how to fix it, but that clearly it is fixable. But Gödel was a mathematical Platonist. He was explicit about it when he wrote about it and when he spoke about it to intimates, that the world of mathematics is something you intuited and discovered. And the way he proved this was to demonstrate in the incompleteness theorems. Well, let me back up slightly. So another name I'm not thinking of today because I'm thinking interstitium. Sort of the leader of mathematics, whose name escapes me right now, set up some basic problems for mathematics that if they could be solved, they would set mathematics on a firm scientific, empirical basis. One of those is that you could devise mathematical systems that were both complete and consistent. Of course, that's what you'd want. If you had something that wasn't complete, then what good was it? Or if it wasn't consistent, meaning it had an internal contradiction of logical forms, then you could prove anything because you'd have two competing things and they could lead to opposite things. So obviously, a complete system, the system you wanted, the mathematical principia of arithmetic had to be both complete and consistent. And it turned out they couldn't figure out how to make it complete and consistent. They thought that was just their problem. Until Gödel comes along and proves with his theorems that if you have a system that is complete, meaning it explains everything, it will necessarily contain a contradiction. And if you have a system that is consistent with itself, and this is the first theorem and the most important one, if you have a system that is consistent, there will necessarily be true statements about the system which cannot be proven within the system. Mm-hmm. In which case, how do you know they're true? By intuition, which is metaphysics, which is how the other pillar of the Vienna Circle falls. And there are attempts like, well, can't you then create a larger system that includes the one you can't prove? So now you've got a system large enough to prove it. But what was then proven is that no, then there'll be other ones out there. You can't tell what is a Gödel unprovable statement by looking at it. Goldbach's conjecture is an example of one that people think is a good candidate because no matter how much people try to explain it, they don't manage to prove it. They don't manage to. So this opens the door back to metaphysics. Now, does it open the door to Buddhist metaphysics? Gödel wrote to his mother in 1963 or something that inevitably people would try to say that, and he didn't think, I can't remember, I quote it in the book, but it's something along the lines of, I can't say they're wrong about that. Yeah, please, go ahead, please.
I've got do you
have it bookmarked?
I have. Well, I do the fiendish thing of underlining in my books. So when I come across,
people have sent me. This is one of the hysterical things. The different ways people read my book. People have sent me pictures of every page multicolored, or a million colored tabs coming out from the book. Someone just told me they've been reading the book by keeping it by their bedside, they're on their nightstand, and every night before going to bed, that they read another 2 random pages. And I think, is that to put yourself to sleep?
Well, I found it very invigorating for the record. On page 147, I'm not sure. I think this is the quote you might be referring to. 147, Gödel himself acknowledged the implications of his work for such other forms of intuition in 1963, writing to his mother, quote, "It was something to be expected that sooner or later my proof will be made useful for religion, since that is doubtless also justified in a certain sense." While he scorned some aspects of religious orthodoxies, he also took issue with how, quote, "even today's study of philosophy does not help much toward the understanding of such religious questions, since after all, 90% of today's religious philosophers see their primary task to be beating thoughts of religion out of people's heads, and thus having the same effect in this sense as the bad churches." I'm not sure if that was the quote that you're thinking of, though.
That is exactly. Yeah. Those are 2 separate quotes, actually, that I mushed together in the paragraph. So what is it to perceive something and know that it's true without being able to prove it scientifically or prove it mathematically? And when we ask questions of consciousness, what we're really asking is, how do I use my mind to explain my mind? From the empirical science point of view, that cannot be answered empirically because it is my mind exploring my mind. Mm-hmm. So there's no separation of subject and object. So it doesn't apply. It's not going to work. From the perspective of intuition, well, what else is the mind exploring the mind except following intuitions?
Well, so here's a couple questions. One is, so yeah, I mean, and so to that end, that the mind reflecting back on itself, trying to gain direct access knowledge about itself, entirely justified. Though it seems like an empiricist might say, well, the best that the mind can do in this regard is learn more about the phenomenological subjective experience of consciousness. And in many ways, that's what meditation is revealing, is like, wow, how does my mind actually work? And when people start meditation, they're often kind of surprised of like, oh man, I can't believe I've had all these thoughts in my head that I wasn't even really consciously aware of, et cetera. And so I think all that's a given, or at least I'm very willing to grant all that. The move that becomes very problematic for me, though, is moving from, okay, I can sit down on a mat and start meditating with the background context that I am a human being at a certain level in the complexity stack with a complex nervous system, that ... There are all these neural correlates of consciousness that, are the mediating aspects, at least, right, for what I'm experiencing. And so even if on that mat, I have this profound experience of universal consciousness, that everything is consciousness, it seems that the only thing I'd be justified in saying is that I, as a human being, have the capacity to experience universal consciousness using my mind architecture, right? Which is different from saying I have experienced universal consciousness and now I can make an objective metaphysical claim about all of existence. That's the thing where I feel like, well, how does one make that leap? And I see this leap made often. I mean, arguably Ken Wilber and other folks make this leap of like, hey, I experienced this on the meditation mat, so now I know what ultimate reality is. It's like, why not just say,
how do I know you're not psychotic?
Well, I don't know.
I mean, that's also something I try to deal with in the book. And actually, I've gotten people on the other side of the equation go, wow, you're really a coward. Because I make a point I don't name it. Again, trying to keep the book short meant a lot of stuff got left out. But Francisco Varela talks about this when he talks about second person perspective. First person perspective, I have this experience. Third person perspective, empirical science, I can observe this and make interpretations because there's separation. But in this realm, specifically talking about these kind of questions, he said we need to bring in second person perspectives. And to me, that was very much informed by his own experience, I think, as a student of the Dalai Lama. The nature of Buddhist practice with a teacher is such that you're always bringing, as I brought in that experience of emptiness, that concept of emptiness to my teacher, and she said, yes, but go back. You got to taste, keep going. So, we have to be careful because we all have very specific perceptions that are specific to us, maybe because our wiring is different. I'm a synesthete, so I have this weird time sense thing. Time has location for me. And I thought everyone experienced that, but it turns out, no, they don't. A friend of mine, the woman who hosted the synesthesia meeting in Stockholm that I went to, she turns out to be a tetrachromat. She's got 4 cones in her eyes like birds instead of 3 and sees 100,000 more colors than we do.
Wow.
Yeah. So what's her world like? I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I've got weird screwed up collagen. And I'm only just now at 65 finding out that a lot of the issues I have with, because of my interstitium work, I'm dealing with people who do body practices a lot. Osteopaths, craniosacral people, energy healers, Tibetan physicians doing pulse stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason this has been opaque to me for a long time is I thought because I'm a Western scientist, and it turns out, no, I have no interoceptive capacity. They're experiencing their bodies in ways that I can't imagine. And some of them are adepts and can experience other bodies because they're not separate bodies, I would say, going back to the other thing. So there's all that stuff that means I have no idea what your perception is. But when you have, so I put my faith in traditions where there is an established lineage where the same training methods bring people to a similar awareness. In Zen, we'd call it mind-to-mind transmission. I know when someone has had that experience because I see it in their behavior. And so over long, it's not simply sit down and meditate for a few weeks. It's not go on a retreat. I've been doing this for 37 years now, and I'm a beginner with a real paucity, I think, of deep experience. The people who study this kind of stuff and comment on it, by and large, are cognitive neuroscientists and philosophers who have never put in the time for a single week of meditative experience, let alone an experience of depth and endurance. And so...
Well, it seems like
I think that our culture has a real poverty of these kinds of experiences, and we talk about it as though we're very sophisticated about it. And from a materialist perspective, it becomes sort of dismissive.
Sure.
The big issue for me is I can't argue for the veracity of my experiences, but I have them in a context of a lineage where there's this back and forth, this second person perspective. And we've got the hard problem of consciousness. And the materialists can't answer it, and the panpsychists can't answer it, but the idealists can very simply. So do I know I'm right? No. Do I find the solution I put in my book satisfying? Pretty much. Does it lead me to find meaning in aspects of my life that I don't find scientifically? Yes. And something you brought up before, well, I would jump to something else, but I'll let you talk.
Yeah. Well, just because I find this to be such an important issue that I feel like it is worth, because I feel like I keep having this conversation a number of times with different folks who have had, who either have had experiences or who are part of lineages that name experiences. And so there's like a profound, I think, epistemological question here that gets raised of that, which can be resolved in different ways. And as you can say, I think maybe in some ways, all we can do is ultimately find a solution that works best for us, that does those things that you were saying. And I think that that's fine, but it also does, I feel like there's something worth continuing to push on that question, especially because when certain things, how would you say, kind of feel like they've met a certain closure, that also then becomes, again, the opportunity for further deconstruction and digging into something, right? But you say on page 151, you talk about the criteria, and I think you're rather explicit that, like, as you just said, you can't just sit on the meditation, cushion for a day and think know what it's about, that you have to use some criteria to be able to parse these kinds of experiences. And so the first one you name is, you say the reported experiences must have a certain depth and reproducibility. So there's a kind of, methodology there. And then you say, second, the experiences must pass through the filter of someone else's assessment. So again, there's like intersubjective, you could say, verification. And both of those are there. And I think those are great criteria. But here's would be the question that I would pose, though, is that what I find interesting, and especially once you start taking into account more kind of postmodern social constructivist, contextual assessments of different religious traditions and praxis and these sorts of things, is that that you can have, how would you say, you can have experiences that would meet both of those criteria, and people do, but then they actually differ, right? So the particular traditions or lineages that you name that do map pretty well to the complexity framework that you're working with are things like, certain forms of Buddhism, Advaita, in the Hindu tradition, and Kabbalah, or
Loriana Kabbalah.
And then
or Kabbalah, whichever.
Depending how you want to stress the accent there. And then Shaivism. And so, but what's interesting, right, is that, like, well, that's there's also a lot left out there, right? Where like in a Christian tradition, right, someone could be in a I don't know, a Benedictine monastery, working over years, doing contemplative prayer, working with their abbot, and then they have this experience of Christ, and Christ talks to them and gives them a message or whatever, and all of that would also meet the criteria of it's a deep and profound thing. Multiple people have experienced it. You can have some kind of, all that, and so then it's like, well, wait a second. So if that's possible in these different contexts, how does this give us any objective information about reality?
Well, number one, there's no such thing as objectivity. That's an empirical science kind of aspiration, because the Vienna Circle didn't work. There's no such thing as objective. You're never going to find an objective stance that explains and contains everything, either by empirical science or by formal logic. Can't be done, number one. Number two, I'm numbering these as though there's actually... it just keeps me going. I mentioned that the reason I talk about those four traditions, because between Manas and I, and that aspect of the book comes from publications he and I wrote, which are cited in the book, where I describe them much more fully, in those. I'm being in an effort to be brief for a general audience, being selective. But those are the traditions that between us, we have either deep academic or deep experiential experiences.
I almost did that same thing, actually. 5
You were
minutes
wondering,
ago.
how was I going to get out of that? Okay, he's in that box now. I leave out a bunch of the Jewish mystical stuff that I just didn't have room for. There are Buddhist debates around these things where people differ, although I argue with those, I think those are all complementarities. One of the things, people come to me with Christian insights or Sufi insights or shamanic insights or and say, what about that? And I'm like, I can't write that book. Please write that book. I'm also lucky to be an American Zen Buddhist and an American Jew in an era where people are talking to each other from different religious cultures. And so I've been part of diverse interfaith dialogues where I watch what happens when they rub up against each other. And one of the things that seems to be a commonplace is you have to rub past the cultural accretions of language and imagery, etc. And then when you get to something, there's something deeper there. It may not be identical. Those four things that I talk about in the book, they're in the paper, actually, we discuss more overlap between them. In the book, what I'm selecting out is the pieces that fit in sequence, that fit together as a puzzle to give a larger picture and actually don't overlap. But I think it's the fact that, well-worn metaphors, the blind people and the elephant. When you're talking about approaching the infinite, there cannot be a single view that encompasses everything objectively. Any human mind is a subjective mind and is conditioned by all manner of material and non-material, karmic, etc. That are going to change what we see, what we receive in the encounter. But in that infinity, there's a legend that when the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, were given at Mount Sinai, there were 600,000 Jews, and thus there are 600,000 versions of the Torah that were given. I think that reflects something real. And the richness of human experience isn't that we can reduce everyone down to a single view of that infinite reality, but that each of us brings in a complementary.
Yeah, no, I just, I'm trying to drill down on that issue of, what are the bounds of using our intuition to be able to make metaphysical claims? I feel like it's a really it's an important question, and I think that there is some truth, certainly, especially where epistemological limitations are just inherent, intrinsic, right? Like there's no other way into what it feels like to be me than to use my own first person perspective.
Right.
So there is no objective take on that. But if I want to use my first person take to also talk about the nature of reality that also then gets at second and third person lenses, then it can be like, like you wouldn't look at your microscope slides and be like, I feel like this one is pathological. People be like, well, wait a second.
That's really interesting because see those notebooks.
Yeah.
Every one of those is a year of 15 liver pathologists from around the planet getting together to exchange about 45 cases on a different topic. And we're kind of, at this point, when we started, we were young. I started the group, I was still in training. There are cases, and this is a major teaching point I have. There are cases where all of us agree. We all say exactly the same thing. There are cases where every single one of us says something different, and we're all world experts. And then there are cases where you realize there's an array, and if you look at who got which slide cut from the same tissue, each slide shows a little something different. And when you put all of them together, all of those things are true. So my daily experience of something that, when people overstate the nature of what I do you're making life and death decisions. I am. But I can tell you the success of a liver transplant team doesn't come from the details of the facts. It comes from the intuitions of the clinicians. And what I have to say about a liver biopsy has no independence from the transplant surgeons and the hepatologists and the patient's reports. And between us is where we get a sense of what to do next. And I think that's one of the messages that I'm talking about in the book. It comes back to the boundless body aspect. Anytime we think where there's a thing over here and a thing over there at any level of scale, yes, that's true. When you ask me for how to deal with this question of, how do we find our way to the true nature of reality and express it in a way that's universal for everyone? That's the urge of someone bounded by their skin. When one version of this, the book came out of giving talks on this for 20 years. And depending on who I was talking to, there was a different way to turn. In Buddhist groups, one way of presenting this remains, that in some Buddhist traditions, we talk about the two pillars of Buddhist practice, wisdom and compassion. Wisdom is seeing the true nature of reality. What's compassion? Well, compassion can be me walking down the street and I see a homeless person and they ask me for money and I'm on my way to my office and I'm dealing with my hip replacement and I've got a cane and did I bring my ID card and oh God, and is this someone who really needs my money or are they scamming me? Or I just see them and go, I got 25 cents. I'll give them 25 cents. Are either of those compassion? Compassion for myself or compassion for someone else? On small c compassion, yeah. But as you go down in levels of scale and your boundaries are wider, when you get to the quantum level, there are no boundaries. If I touch a hot stove and my hand sticks, with my right hand sticks, my left hand doesn't sit and think, should I help or not? It just leaps. Why? Because they're not separate. This gets me choked up too. If you have an experience of the true nature of reality, if you have plumbed the depths of real wisdom, so you have a sense of the true nature of reality, maybe not complete, there's ever more detail to be found, but the natural result of that is compassion, because there is no separation. So I don't know why I went there. remember what.
Well, it's a wonderful place to land. So, and I want to respect your time as well, because yeah. But no,
I don't.
but no, I thank you for that, and I think that's actually a very beautiful place to kind of just to bring that. And there's a lot more that could be said about that. There's a lot more that could be said about all of this. I really appreciate again you taking the time and fielding some of these questions. This stuff is very alive for me, and it's great to be able to speak with people who have spent a lot of time, not just thinking, but all forms of praxis related to these issues, and so to dig into that wisdom sandbox. I don't know, I'm mixing metaphors here, but
For me,
is great. And so anyway, it's very well appreciated. Is there anything else you want to throw in before we call it a day, or I don't know.
No, that's plenty, but I'm looking forward to talking to you after you turn the recording.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you so much, Neil Theise. And
sure.
this is a wonderful book. I mean, people, please check this book out. Notes on Complexity. And looking forward to your next one. No doubt, likewise, a follow-up award, some medal winner of some kind. We'll see. But anyway, much appreciated. Thank you. Appreciate it. Godspeed.
Thank you, Brendan.